Hello, everybody. Welcome to a recording for History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Bird. Dr. Bird is an East Coaster by upbringing, undergrad, and graduate schools. Dr. Bird has taught in New Jersey, Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Oregon, and is currently a visiting assistant professor of religious studies at Hollins University. On the side, she carves out time for speaking and writing on marriage and the Bible. Her background within the United Methodist Church Education Presbyterian affiliated institution, time spent in several ministerial contexts, 6 years of graduate study, and 20 years of teaching classrooms of all kinds, all inform her approach to having quite honest and sometimes difficult conversations about what is actually to be found in the scriptures of the Christian Bible. And today we're going to be discussing her book, Permission Granted. Take the Bible into your own hands, and I'll leave a link to purchase this book in the description of this video to several different websites. Welcome to History Valley Podcast, Dr. Bird.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate you having me on.
Of course. What are your views about the Bible's view of women in general? Because several people will say, well, the Bible has no problem with women, and others will say, actually, it does, and then others will point out there's contradictions. Sometimes it's misogynist, and sometimes it's not. It'll go back and forth like a coin flipping. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have to say I would agree with the coin flipping piece. My general sense is, I think there's a lot of misogyny. Mostly, there's a lot of silencing of women. The voice that women are allowed to have in stories is often kind of stereotypically negative or whiny or manipulative or whatever. I mean, there are all kinds of things that even when women do get to kind of show up in their own stories, we still need to have a little bit of, okay, I'm not sure I like the depiction here. There's a heavy dose of women are primarily baby makers. It's not like I'm against that. None of us would be here without that. But as the takeaway, that is the ultimate role of women. I find that misogynist. I find that sexist. I don't, so there are people will talk about Proverbs, for instance, the Proverbs 31 woman, she's doing all things. Yeah. But she's also really wealthy. And she's also a couple other things that just, she'll end up in the emergency room if you actually live that way for too long. Like, looking at the Newer Testament and in particular, the things said about women, when you start to look in the scholarship, people will talk about the things that Jesus is attributed with saying in the Gospels. Is he being rude or is he being snarky? Is he, people have a range of ways of reading what's depicted there as well. And then, of course, everyone's favorite Paul, right? Is he a sexist? Is he misogynistic? Is he empowering for women? And one of the things, I don't want to go too long on this just first prompt question, but one of the things I want to point out is that it's helpful for me when I think about some of the people, men, women, or otherwise today, and how most people I interact with don't want to be sexist, but they're not aware of how their own thinking is at times. And in fact, I still have sexist thoughts that pop up in my head because of where I grew up, not my family specifically, but like in the South and the East of the United States, so people can be sexist even if they're trying not to be. And that's today. So Paul in the first century, come on now, so I think that there are moments, for instance, when Paul has these comments that are kind of egalitarian, but then, 2 chapters later or 2 chapters back, he was being, wow, that was awkward that you just said that, Paul, So, and I think they both show up in the letters, the genuine letters of Paul as well. And then there's just a lot more just kind of generally sexist stuff in the Deutero letters of Paul, I think. So does that address your question?
I think it does. And I think it perfectly leads up to my next question about Paul.
Okay. Yeah.
So do you think that Paul had contradictory views about women in the authentic letters?
Yeah. Yeah, I really do. And I've had some, there's this very awkward thing. I mentioned this to you briefly or in our conversation about before we recorded, that I've actually changed my own mind about how I read one or two of the kind of questionable passages in First Corinthians, actually. And so I used to have this like, well, I think that Paul was generally trying to be egalitarian or something, and so I'm going to read these really difficult two passages in a way that make it okay that, and he's not actually being sexist.
Hmm.
Because we see in Rome, in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul is talking about people just using their gifts, and he's not talking about it in a gendered way. That can be really freeing and empowering for lots of people.
Hmm.
And then, like, the prior chapter or 2 chapters later, he's saying really sexist stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I think that he is both. And again, I think it's partly one of those people don't even today, people aren't aware of, um, some of the things they say as being sexist. They mean well, and then there's these really deeply rooted things that come out. And so for me, that's helpful as a way of thinking about what Paul was doing, and he's reacting to things more than he's actually setting down and planning out what to say and making it all consistent with everything else he said. I don't think he did that at all. And I think he's reacting, And so when we see in chapter 7 of First Corinthians, some interesting kind of egalitarian things when he's talking about couples, that's egalitarian, what he says there. Well, that's kind of cool. And then this thing about everybody using your gifts, and you just talk about, well, that's kind of cool. But then these other two things in chapter 11 and 14, I think I tried to make it work. And I have had some colleagues, and then, there was a really important book by Antoinette Weyer, The Corinthian Women Prophets, that I read in graduate school before I wrote this book. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it all. I didn't have the time to sit with it. It's kind of dense, but I've returned to it since. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I think she's right. I don't think it's an interpolation in chapter 14. And I don't think that, what I was doing before makes sense. So yeah, there's conflicting, even in the same letter, there are conflicting messages about women from Paul in his genuine letters. Yes, I think so.
So would it be fair to say that even if that particular verse in 1 Corinthians 14 that is hailed by some to be an interpolation is taken out, it wouldn't really resolve the other contradictions that are there?
Because of what's going on, at least in chapter 14. Oh, excuse me, chapter 11. And when he kind of makes that like, well, men were created first and women for them, but blah, blah, blah. At the end of that little rant in chapter 11, he does still come out and say, well, we don't have this practice. But in the midst of this little rant, he has shown his true colors, right? That he does still kind of defer to a particular reading of Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 that are really fairly sexist. But the interpolation bit in chapter 14, and does taking that out, does that resolve the issue? I would say no, it doesn't. And also partly because of the other greater trajectory of Antoinette Weyer's message or her purpose in the book Corinthian Women Prophets is that there's a lot going on in the 2 Corinthian correspondences, which, is, you probably know, is maybe more than just 2 letters have been put together. But there's a lot going on in there, rhetorically speaking, without it being directly saying women shut up and sit down. There are other things going on in there that also add to this, silencing of women or dismissing of them. Does that make sense? Without it being directly to them, it's still there, kind of in between the lines.
So do you think that in later manuscripts of First Corinthians, when some scholars point out that the verse in question that some believe is interpolation moves around, do you think that could be the result of a copyist mistake, placing in the wrong place?
That's a great question. And it's really funny because it didn't occur to me to brush up on what she was saying about that. I don't know, when it's in an entirely different place, I do think that is, is that someone's trying to smooth it over, that they didn't think it fit very well, these ideas. So this seems to fit better here. I mean, I really actually like your question, because part of what it's doing is showing that I don't know all the ins and outs of this theory, how to handle the manuscript. I know that when I read the second or third time Wyer's scholarship on it, I realized that I was gonna have to just trust her scholarship because I still didn't, like, internalize it all, and she had gone through so deeply and carefully with these ancient script manuscripts, comparing them to each other and all the different possibilities. Um, so, I think and sorry if this feels like a deflection of your question, but I think
Mhm.
it's similar to the story about the woman, quote, "caught in adultery." I like to think of her as more like framed or something to try to, catch Jesus, but that also shows up in a couple different places in the manuscripts. It's a pretty important story, and I don't know that it was original with John, but it's a great story. I also still have problems with that story, but it was important enough to have in there, and so not I don't think it's a direct parallel, but I think there's something similar going on, that this idea was in there and does show up in a different place, a different location, um, in one manuscript, one important manuscript. I don't actually know the details specifically, but, um is that someone's way of trying to make it work better, trying to make it sound are they trying to make it more appealing? Are they I don't yeah, I don't know that that dismisses the possibility of it being original, right? Just because it moves around. Um, I don't know. I also don't need to have it personally. I don't personally need to have it definitively figured out. So
Mhm.
I'm doing my best to play along with what is important to you because I think it's cool and that you and others are really interested in this and it matters. And I do think it matters. I just don't. Yeah. Mhm. Might not have the best answer for you.
No, that's completely all right. So, all I was really asking is, do you think it's possible that it could have been simply a copyist mistake?
Yeah. Mistake
Mistaken
or
for something else?
intention, even.
Mhm.
Yeah. An intentional shift, potentially.
Mhm.
Yeah. Hmm.
Setting aside the contended 1 Corinthians 14 verse,
Okay.
um, do you think that there are other actual interpolations into Paul's authentic letters?
It's so funny that you asked that, and you even gave me a heads up you're gonna ask that.
Hmm.
Because I don't know of interpolations in Paul's genuine letters elsewhere. I know it's funny because the 2 that I have held on to when I first learned about them back in graduate school or whatever, have to do with Mark's gospel, the opening line where
Hmm.
Son of God is a later addition. Um, because that's kind of big in the realm of talking about Jesus. And then the thing about Ephesus, the opening line in Ephesus and the reference to it, that's been added. We can see it in one of the ancient manuscripts where it's in the margin.
You're
So
talking
that
about
was in
you're
well,
talking about Ephesians, right?
yes, Ephesians, yeah. And so those are the 2 I kind of held on to that it's like, yeah, whatever. And so I don't know about specific interpolations within the genuine Paul,
Mhm.
elsewhere. And that's partly just because it's not been a thing I've, um, felt the need or really had the time or need to look into. I do know that there are a lot of, you know, there are countless small differences throughout the Newer Testament collection manuscripts, but specifically Paul, I think is you're getting at something important there, I think, in terms
Mhm.
of why you're asking that question, which is an interesting, I mean, it's an interesting point. It's an interesting question to ask, I think.
What do you think about what Paul says in Galatians, that I am all things to all men? And he'll say in other places, I am to, to those that are under the law, that say that they're under the law, and then he says, I'm under the law. To those that are not under the law, he's not under the law. So do you think he's admitting there that he'll shift his views on purpose depending on audience? And could
Yes.
that be influencing what he's doing with the women thing, the contradictions about his views on women?
Sure. Sure. I definitely think that there is an over identification with some of his audiences at
Hmm.
times. And in particular, when it comes to talking about the law is like one of the last things I ever want to talk about because it's like Hey, guess what, folks? According to Paul's own definition, Gentiles do not need to give a rat's ass about the law. So why are the descendants of Gentiles within the Christian tradition making such a big deal of it? And it's because there's a thing there that people aren't clear about. Paul was a Jew through and through. I firmly believe that he was a Jew to his dying day. And did he over time start to kind of identify more with this sect of Judaism that became Christianity? So the sect that did see Jesus in this particular way and was a community that was handling the law a little bit differently than other Jews were. Did he start to identify with them? And then therefore did some of his language also reflect that? I think that's possible because I know that people do that, and so did his own theological identification change, his own understanding of himself? That is absolutely possible. But I think that question of the law, it wasn't necessarily your intention here, but more the bigger picture. When it comes to the law and Jews, I think we fundamentally misunderstand, kind of this steepedness of the connection there, so that when he says that, I kind of chuckle. I'm like, really, Paul? Like, you kind of are, but you're talking to a group of people who don't. So maybe you're just becoming all things in this moment, right? And over identifying with them in order to make your point and to be heard. Now, when you say that, see, here's the thing. This is interesting that you asked that, because the way I used to read 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16, was that he was trotting out all these other ideas that he knew others believed, in order to just say, put them on the table, and then to ultimately shoot them all down and say, none of it really matters because I don't have this practice. And I published an article that said that as part of a bigger picture. It wasn't the main point I was trying to make, but I've gone down in print, not just in permission granted, but in more scholarly setting, and I have colleagues that just really thought were very confused with me over that, and just, thought that was weird. Was he over identifying with these other perspectives in order just to get them heard? That was how I read that, to make it make sense. I've changed my mind, and I think that he was actually just trotting out the ideas that were out there, and that he might or might not have disagreed with any of them, and it's really hard to know, right? But he is putting out there this sexist reading, really, of Genesis 2, which is not actually an honest reading of Genesis 2. When you talk about woman being created second and woman being created for men, like, that isn't actually what the Genesis 2 story is saying. So he's doing a misreading of his own scriptures there, or he's trotting out someone else's misreading of that, but he also puts it in Romans. So, it's like, yeah, I think I'm not going to be able to have a definitive response to that specific thing. Which is it that explains these kind of moments of sexist or comments from him? Is it because he's just playing along, so people will listen? But it isn't really what he thinks. I think that's possible, and that's how I read it. But I think it's also just as likely that it's showing true colors.
So by the time we get to the canonical Gospels, and they're seeing all of these contradictions in Paul's epistles, and maybe even in other texts that we don't have today, do you think the Gospel writers were overwhelmed by not only the contradictions in Paul's epistles, but the different varieties of people that were called Christians or not called Christians just yet, but depending on the term, if the term existed or not? I know some people have different opinions on that. At the time that this stuff was being written down, what do you think about that?
What do I think about, just so I'm clear, do I think that the gospel writers themselves were overwhelmed by the number of versions, essentially, or
Yes.
number of, to be honest, I go back and forth on this, but the reason is because we don't know to what extent any of the gospel, to what extent they were familiar with the collection of Paul's writing letters, right? Because those weren't necessarily circulating over in the Palestine, Judea region. They were circulating over in Asia Minor and in current Greece. And so, to what extent did any of those gospel writers know about these other ideas or small groups that may have just been right up the road from them? But I like the question anyway, because I think it's important to note that there never has been a singular definition of what it means to be a part of this sect that became Judaism. Excuse me, this sect of Judaism that became Christianity. There's never been just a single definition of that. There has always been, from the very, very beginning. I mean, I disagree with some other historians when they trust Acts too much, for instance, or when they take it as historical. I can't do that. And I think there's too much of an agenda going on in the book of Acts.
So would you lean towards the Gospels not being too concerned with those contradictions?
The contradictions being
Paul's view on women
from the very beginning. Yeah. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. Scholars do not agree on who started this sect that became Christianity. So that there is not an agreement on who got the church started. And one of the reasons that this is really fascinating to me is, if you're Jesus or Jesus's followers, you're Jewish and you're doing your Jewish thing, and you're just you're frustrated with your own Jewish leadership for exploiting the people, and that what happens to people that try to speak up about social injustices and economic injustices, in particular by your own people who happen to also be religious leaders. Like when people speak up about that, you get crushed. That's what happens. And when those leaders are in cahoots with Rome or Roman officials, or however you want to look at that, like having Jesus be killed is what you would expect to have happen. And so his own disciples, in my opinion, are going to they're going to take that torch. They're going to take the torch of, our religious leaders, the leaders in the temple in Jerusalem, have sold out on some level, even if that's an overgeneralization of what happened. That is how they're interpreting it, and they're being exploited, and people are dying, and it's awful. That's not Christian or Christianity. That's a perpetuation of a segment of Judaism that's frustrated with their leaders. What Paul does is just radically different. And I absolutely think that Paul started the sect that became Christianity. And so people disagree in terms of which parts of the Newer Testament they want to turn to for input on, what kinds of ideas were floating around out there. When we look at the Gospels themselves that they're coming in after Paul has started this thing. I mean, really, it's just kind of this weird, mind-blowing thing every time I start to think about this in terms of what Paul started, what he was doing, and then someone else comes along and decides to tell the story of Jesus's life, but they're doing it with this 2020 or this looking back through what Paul has decided to say about Jesus. And so you're going to have to tell Jesus' story in a way that's not really true to what would have gone down. Did the writer of Mark and Matthew sit down and have dinner? Did they? Because they wouldn't have agreed with each other, right? The thing that those two guys are depicting about Jesus is almost mutually exclusive. Right? So yeah, I mean, did they care that there was someone else out there saying something radically different? I imagine they probably did if they knew about it. Were they overwhelmed by it? I don't know. I also don't think that the Gospels themselves had or the reach of this guy Jesus's life hadn't reached the numbers, to make it this massive, overwhelming, cacophony of ideas and things out there, but that there were different strands and there were different versions of him that were being told and passed around for sure. I like the question, do I think that they were overwhelmed by this multiplicity? I don't know. But it's a good question,
I remember you bringing up in the book that some imagine Paul as being the first Christian or the founder of Christianity. What do you make of that?
Yeah. So the chapter in the book was Paul the first Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think he thought of himself as a Christian. I think on some basic level, it's important to acknowledge that the label Christian, like, post dates Paul. So it was used initially by one group of Jews to refer to that other group of Jews up there, Paul's church, as a slur. Those Christ ones, right? And it was used to refer to the community in Antioch, Syrian Antioch, but around the year 67. And I'm with the people who assume that Paul was executed sometime during the Neronian persecution earlier than that, just maybe a couple years earlier than that. So I don't think Paul was even around at the time that the label Christian was even being used, or was first being used. And then it takes another 60 years before it to be a label that community has fully embraced, kind of the way people have fully embraced slurs over the centuries. Very different context politically, and I'm not trying to equate them, but just to say this happened, right? It was initially a slur, and they embraced it, and it takes time for that to happen, for that kind of, oh yeah, I'll show you, you're going to call us that, we'll claim that. Now I think this conversation goes back to your earlier questions about to what extent was Paul identifying with, maybe overly becoming all things to all people, in terms of would he have thought of himself as being like the Gentiles who are a part of this sect? Would he have, is his oneness language, unifying language, all one body, does that mean that he kind of had no longer thought of himself through the lens of his Jewish identity and all of those kinds of things? I think that's possible.
What do you think?
I don't know to what extent we should be talking about Paul and Christianity in general. And I don't know that he was necessarily trying to create a thing that would be so radically different there would need to be a schism. But his initial thoughts, I think, absolutely taken to their conclusions, require that the schism that took place is what's going to take place. But yeah, anyway.
In Philippians, when Paul says that he's a Pharisee, then he goes on to say that he is a Hebrew of Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think he means by that? That he's a Hebrew of Hebrews?
I think that's just a reference to the very early people, ancient people and ancestors, right? So the Hebrew people in the, well, really in the Torah, because once they start settling is when we start seeing their ancestors using labels that identifying with Israel or Israelites. But in the Torah, the label of Hebrew people comes up every now and then. So I think it's a way of saying, original people, I'm that. I'm from that. I go, I trace my ancestry, or my connection goes all the way back to the original, the OGE people, right? As a way of saying this, I'm really Jewish. And I don't say that, I'm not mocking that, by the way. I'm just saying, that's okay. What do you think that means?
It almost sounds like to me he's being very boastful about himself and his lineage.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, he's very arrogant, and he's needing to prove that he is. You should listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. A Pharisee of Pharisees, a Hebrew of Hebrews. It's absolutely bragging. Yeah, I agree with you for sure. Mm-hmm.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.